Hey everyone, welcome to the third episode of the Sports Psych Show. On this show, I'm going to be speaking with Doug Lemov. Doug is a teacher and teaching mentor, and he's passionate about teaching. He believes that teaching is a performance profession. What he does is he studies high-performing teachers. He takes what they do in the classroom and teaches other teachers how to use those tools and techniques, how to use those skills to help influence young people in the classroom. Doug is Managing Director of Uncommon Schools, which is a non-profit network of public charter schools in New York, New Jersey and Massachusetts. He's also got some great books on the market, including Practice Perfect, Reading Reconsidered, but he's perhaps best known for his book Teach Like a Champion, which has recently been updated to Teach Like a Champion 2.0. I use all these books as resources to help coaches. He's got a BA from Hamilton College, an MA from Indiana University, and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. I just love Doug's work, and I use not only his books as resources, but his website to help coaches be better at what they do. And this is why I invited Doug onto the podcast, because so much of coaching is about being a great teacher. So let's get this podcast started. Introducing Doug Lemov. Doug Lemov, thank you very much for joining me today on the Sports Psych Show. Delighted to have you on. In fact, honoured because I've read a few of your books, the practice book, Teach Like a Champion. I haven't got around to Teach Like a Champion 2.0 yet, so I'm still making my way through your other ones and using the tools and the techniques that you talk about. But it's great to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to it.
So, one of the things I read, that a statement you made about teaching that really hit home to me, and I'm guessing it's kind of the template that you might work from, is teaching is a performance profession. Mm-hmm. Teaching is a performance profession. And that strikes me almost as your driving motivation is to put yourself out there in the teaching profession, as you have done for the past decade, and motivate teachers to see teaching in this way, that it's a performance profession. You can improve at your ability and capability of being a teacher. Would that be a fair thing to say?
It would. It's interesting because I would hope that would doubly resonate with coaches, which is coaching is a teaching profession or as a performance profession about performance professions. But I think it's fascinating that one of the things we're always trying to prepare players for is the necessity of live performance, right? That I can't stop in the middle of a match and say, I wish I'd done that differently. How should I solve this problem, right? They're live and they have to do that. And really that is replicated by the experience of teachers. I'm in the middle of a session, whether I'm working with footballers or math students. And in the middle, I can't say, what do I do if I ask a question and nobody answers, or everyone looks at me funny? That I'm live and I have to be ready to respond to situations. And so one of the recipes for success in a performance profession for coaches and teachers, as much as for football players and rugby players and cricket players, is practice beforehand, rehearsal, preparation. And sometimes you practice the things that are most important. And sometimes you practice things that are relatively unimportant because you want them to come out automatically. My daughter is a footballer, your kind of football, not our kind of football. And she, the first time she did a Cruyff turn, we'd been working on Cruyff turns in the basement over and over and over. And she couldn't really do one in the game because the game is complex. And by the time she thought, this would be a great place for me to do a Cruyff turn, the ball's at the other end of the pitch and the opportunity is gone. So we kept on working on it, and finally she was at midfield, she did a beautiful Cruyff turn, and after the game I said, "My, great Cruyff turn. Finally got it." And she said, "What Cruyff turn? I didn't do a Cruyff turn." Like, she had automated it in preparation so that it came out without her even realizing that she'd done it. And in many cases, that's what you have to do when you're expecting to operate in a very complex environment. The closer you can get to automating your skills, the more likely they are to come out, and the more you can have your mind on more important things.
Absolutely. No, that's really, it's fascinating, isn't it? That in that performance environment, your daughter has gone on to automation I think I read a statistic somewhere, and I think this is one of these data points that is either over exaggerated or underplayed, that 75% of what you're doing on the course or the pitch,
Mm-hmm.
you're not aware that you're doing it. You're just playing, you're just competing. Somebody, if you're doing it very well, somebody might describe that as the zone, or you're in flow. But a lot of what you're doing, you're not thinking about it, you're just doing. And would you say that that's, we're going to obviously over the next hour bring things back to the sports pitch, the course, the course, but in that classroom environment, is that as a teacher, I'm thinking in terms of, a coach as well, as a teacher, are you trying to help your students get into that state of flow, in essence, whereby they're completely absorbed in either what you're saying or what you're doing, or the facts that you are presenting to them?
I think yes. That one of the things that characterizes a great learning environment is, I would just say, deep engagement. I think engagement is a tricky word, because sometimes it can seem like engagement is something that it's a series of tap dances that you do to fool kids into wanting to pay attention in the classroom. And to me, the best teachers are ones who help kids lose themselves in the content, almost lose track of time, right? I'm so deeply into what I'm doing that I lose track of, I'm in the flow state. I lose track of what's happening around me. And I think that great teachers routinely accomplish that. In a variety of ways. So I think that's awesome. And I think that coaching is probably even a little bit different in that a couple of books that I think are really fascinating reads that I'll just queue up that maybe we can talk about, and maybe some of your listeners will want to read. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, I think is fascinating on this topic, where, so much of the thinking that we have to do on the sports field is faster than you can have a conscious thought. And just to take an example from baseball in America, the average pitched ball in baseball arrives at home plate in 4/10 of a second, and it takes 6/10 of a second to have a conscious thought.
Yep.
And so, what is it that allows some batters to be much more successful? It turns out that it's perception. It's what they're looking at before the ball arrives.
Yep.
But it's learning to operate in an environment where you have to operate more quickly than you can have conscious thoughts. I think is a second level of flow that we have to be alert to as coaches of athletes. At least in sports like a sport like football or a sport like rugby, where things happen faster than we can think about them.
And I think that I'm perhaps in slight danger of going off on in a different direction here than I started. But saying that just demonstrates to me, or reminds me of, how challenging coaching on the run is. Because in sports, whether it's soccer, whether it's rugby over here, in any team game, invasion sport, where you've got, it's quick, it's instinctive, and yet you're trying to help these players improve. And so the ability to coach on the run, I guess in the classroom, it's nobody's moving as such, and in fact you're trying to stop them from moving, whereas on the sports field you're trying to get them moving. You've got to be able to teach on the go in the classroom. You've got to be able to coach on the run, and that's a real challenge. That's something I work on with coaches, to be able to engage players on the run.
Yeah. You mean without stopping to say, pause, I want to tell you something, live coaching while players are actually executing.
In essence, there's always going to be a time where you've got to do that. But when you want to have representation of the actual environment you're competing in, when you want to have a similar intensity, but you still want to get some coaching points across without disrupting play too much. I think the feedback I've had from coaches over the last 15 years, I was a golf coach where it's as static and as stationary as you're going to get.
Yeah.
But from sports that are on the go, on the move all the time, that's the feedback I've had from coaches, where the challenge is coaching on the go, getting your coaching points across when everybody's running around.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. It really is the challenge. And I was thinking about this. I was watching a pretty elite coach coaching on Friday night. And I was thinking about the difference between teaching and learning and when those things happen. So he coaches one of the top university football teams in the US. And so he stopped the practice. They're playing 11v11, and it's early in the season. He's trying to describe to them how he wants them to play tactically in a 4-4-2 with a diamond. And he stops them and he says, he does a really nice job. He's really fast with this stoppage, right? One of the things that goes wrong is we spend too much time talking, and we try and make 5 or 6 points. And then, one of the coaches at the New Zealand All Blacks had this great phrase. He said, if you chase 5 rabbits, you catch none, which is if I stop players and I try to tell them to do 5 things at once, when they start again, they're not going to be able to think about which one of them to do. If they do any of them, I won't even know which one they focus on. So I have to be disciplined about giving one thing to focus on, which I think that keeps it shorter so I don't disrupt the flow of play.
Yep.
Then when people start playing afterwards, it allows them to focus on doing that one thing, which just reminds so the teaching and the learning are different, right? The teaching happens in the moment, the learning happens afterwards. So he stops. He asks the strikers how they're feeling. They're on defense. They're tired because they're running back and forth across the field, trying to press the outside backs. Who can help? Outside midfielders. Outside midfielders, where should you be? And he's trying to talk to them about playing in a more advanced position.
Yep.
He's talking to one of the outside midfielders, and I'm watching him and I can tell this outside midfielder's confused. He doesn't, he says, where should you be? And he's kind of looking around, and the other guys are helping him. And so finally he gets into the position, and the coach describes, this is the position I want you to be in. It's 5 yards in advance of your man. You can, so you can help put pressure on the outside.
Yep.
He taught this beautifully. He described it. He let them visualize it, which is really important. That's the teaching, but that's different from the learning. And so our conversation after the training session was what happened afterwards to make sure, because he was confused in the moment. And I think it's very unlikely that he was going to, execute correctly the next 10 times this happened.
Okay.
What can you do to make sure that after you've taught well, the learning happens? Right. One is to only focus on that thing. But one of the most common things I think that happens for coaches is as soon as they make that teaching point, they forget about that teaching point and they're off on something else. The boys start playing and they're like, great ball, get it wide, faster pass. Right there. The message is, I've forgotten the feedback that I gave you already. I've stopped thinking about it. You should too. And so we talked about how he could either appoint one of his assistant coaches to do nothing for the next 3 or 4 minutes, but give the outside midfielders feedback on whether they were positioned correctly. So they knew and got constant feedback and constant iterations. Or he could do that process. Yes, Peralta, that's high enough. No, not high enough. Higher still, right? So the learning is really this player going through the experience of getting it right and driving it into muscle memory in the sequence after the teaching. And so I think one of the things that I find it helpful to work on with coaches is to coach an energetic game live in the flow. I have to make my stop just quick and sharp and focused. And then I have to think about how do I reinforce what happens afterwards, which is really when a lot of the learning takes place.
I love what you've just said. And I'm just going to reflect back what I've heard. So at this topic of there's a difference between teaching and learning. And I think you've said teaching is a performance profession, and so is coaching. Coaching is a performance profession. So, let's begin at the beginning here. Certainly, when I speak with coaches, when I work with coaches, I want them to see it in the same way. Too many coaches sit down a couple of hours before their training session. They sit down with a blank piece of A4 paper and they say, okay, what are my activities? And they're not necessarily, I talk about not necessarily seeing the psychosocial and mindset part, but also what they're not seeing it is in terms of picturing, visualizing, mentally rehearsing what they're going to do, how they're going to be, how they're going to react and respond to adversity. So what is their performance going to be like? But and that's so important to help promote this notion of I'm going to help players learn. I'm not just going to teach them, I'm going to help them learn, because there is a disparity, there's a difference between teaching and learning. And it's never more obvious, if you like, than when you're coaching on the run. Because when you're coaching on the run, the challenge is to help players learn and not just to teach them, not just to tell them. And I think too many coaches, or let me put this more positively, coaches could be even better at what they do when they become passionate about players learning and not just telling them. It's not just, I've got this knowledge in my head, I'm going to impart this knowledge. It's how do I help these players or this player process things on a deeper level? Yeah. And so what I've learned from you there, and you talked a little bit about the All Blacks, is you said, look, stop 1 point. One, maybe two maximum, but 1 point, get that across. And I love what you said about visualization, because I think in that moment, again, what the coach can do is make their point, but then, you can say, tell me about what do you experience there, what do you feel there, what do you see? I want you to see that in your mind's eye. Just imagine yourself doing that next. If the ball's not coming to you, just think about that in the moment. And then you hit upon another really important notion is co-coaching. So many coaches, Doug, don't appreciate the importance of if I'm lucky enough to have assistants and volunteers, how do I use them? And as you keenly pointed out there, well, okay, I might be tracking the play as it moves on. Now I can use my co-coach to reinforce what we've just worked on with that player. Yeah.
Which validates them and makes them that. This coach I watched, he was really an excellent coach, and he was so sophisticated in the way that he thought about culture on the team and the relationship of the players on the team. And it was fascinating because the first thing he said to me when I got there was he pointed out and introduced his assistant coaches, and he told me how much he loved them and how much he respected them and how good they were. And ironically, he was thinking about the team, the players, but he wasn't thinking about the team of his coaches and really empowering his coaches to have significant roles. And so they kind of jumped in where they could, and one of them ran a warm-up drill, but they didn't really have portfolios that made them important. And I know that he was very genuine in his absolute respect for them. So I think thinking about there are two team cultures you're managing as a coach. One is the team is the team among the players, but there's also the team among the other coaches, and unlocking the value of those people and their capacity to help you do what you're trying to do. I think it's, you described a coach sitting down with a piece of paper and planning. So part of planning is what am I doing and what am I going to talk about? Part of planning is what are the players going to do? I have a couple of other thoughts about planning that I'll come back to, but one of the other thoughts is what is the role of my assistant coaches during this? Am I giving them something specific to look for? Are they working with individual players? Are they watching to see if something happens? The more I can give them a real responsibility, the more they can deliver value in the coaching setting.
Which in turn helps improve the experience of the players. Whether that's the experience of taking on board coaching techniques and having that reinforced for them by this co-coach, whether that's just being engaged, knowing that there's another pair of eyes on me, feeling valued. You talk about culture there. I think coaches underestimate how much when they think about culture, they think about stuff off the pitch, but it's no, this is on the pitch.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. On the pitch, I think that's absolutely true. So I think that's true, and I think even. When you want to build relationships, one of the most important ways to build relationships is to help people be successful, right? I think there are at least in the classroom, there are a lot of teachers who think, I have to establish relationships first with people before I can help them be successful. And so they walk around, high-fiving kids and look, some of that stuff is valuable. But one of the ways that people come to believe in the adults in their lives or the coaches in their lives or the authority figures in their lives is if they are genuinely effective at getting them better at things that are important to them. And so I'm thinking about this moment with this outside midfielder who's clearly confused about what he's supposed to do. If the coach says, great, Coach Jones is gonna watch you now for the next 5 minutes. If you're not high enough, he's going to say higher. If you're high enough, he's going to say good, and so you're for the next 5 minutes, you're going to get intense focus on where exactly you should be in the situation. I've solved he wants to be successful as a player. I've solved a problem for him. I've shown, I've invested in him, and I've shown, because I think what happens when players struggle, what happens when players struggle? When I have this interaction, outside midfielders need to be higher when we're pressing for the ball. Peralta doesn't do it.
Yep.
Maybe I don't notice, then like maybe later in practice, he's still not doing it, or worse, in the game, he's not doing it. What happens? Coaches blame the players. God damn it, Peralta, we talked about this. We talked about how you need to be higher. Why weren't you higher, right? And so it's very easy to blame learners when they're not successful. And sometimes it is on the learner. Sometimes the learner is not committed. Sometimes the learner is not focused. Sometimes the learner is not trying hard. But sometimes it's not even a question of fault. It's a question of insufficient learning environment, right? John Wooden, the great American basketball coach, has this great line. He says, "Teaching is knowing the difference between I taught it and they learned it."
Yes. Yeah.
Right. That's it. Right. Just because it's the same in the classroom. Just because I stood up there and talked about the causes of the American Civil War for 60 minutes does not mean that students understand it fully. In fact, if it's a complex topic, why would I think that they would understand it fully and with nuance after one interaction? And so I have to, one, build a culture that reinforces it sufficiently. But two, I always have to be testing for this and not presuming that the fact that I talked about it meant that players get mastery. But coaches describe this all the time, right? Halftime speech. Guys, we worked on this all week. We're still not, right? So that's the description of the difference between I taught it and they learned it. And I just think that so one more just seen from this session that I was watching, when this guy Peralta was confused. At one point, the coach said, "Peralta, where should you be?" And Peralta was just like, he was clearly befuddled by this question and didn't know, and was looking around. The other guys were like, "Peralta, aha," And so he put his arm around Peralta and he said, "It's okay. If you don't know, I want you to tell me. It tells me more about my teaching and how my teaching needs to be better." Right. And so he did two things in that moment. One is he used that data point as a recognition that it's his responsibility to make sure that he builds a teaching environment to make sure that his players get mastery rather than blaming Peralta. He's like, okay, how do I have to think about presenting this information differently? And he made it safe for Peralta to tell him when he doesn't understand, right? If my goal is, as John Wooden says, to understand the difference between I taught it and they learned it, if my players are trying to hide it from me, if they're afraid to tell me, if they have to pretend that they understand when they don't, it will be 100 times harder for me to understand what they don't understand and therefore fix it. And the only time I'll find out will be in the game when we fail. And so I thought this was just a beautiful moment when he said, "I want you," he made it safe psychologically, the arm around him, like, "Great, you don't understand. I'm really glad I know that. Thank you for telling me." The next time Peralta is confused, he's 10 times more likely to be like, "Coach, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here." And that's success to me in a coaching environment, when a player initiates a discussion about his own lack of understanding so that the coach can help him solve the problem.
Now, you call this building a culture of error.
That's right.
Don't you? Yeah, building a culture of error, and I love this because you've hit upon a term. I'm boring everybody around me at the moment with this term of psychological safety.
It's so important.
Amy Edmondson's work from Harvard University, obviously in the business world, medical, when she did a PhD or post-grad stuff in medical departments, but just bringing it into the world of sport is so important. So building a culture of error, as you've alluded to, is, if in the classroom environment, if students try to hide mistakes from you, I've heard you say that it can be 10 times harder to, be able to help them, deal with those mistakes. Whereas if you create this classroom environment, okay, and replace classroom for the course of the pitch, create this environment in terms of, psychological safety, there will be error. Mistakes will happen. Because sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just jumping to keep inevitable. They're inevitable, right? Yeah, if our teaching is challenging enough, of course people won't get it all right. If they get it all right, the material's not hard enough. It's
mastery. It's trying to be the best that we can be. So there's going to be error. And I think coaches are so scared, but what I like about your saying is there's almost not so much an attribution of blame, but it's the coach in his or her own mind attributing improvement on him or herself. And it's kind of, look, I always say to coaches, you do have to be, coaching is tough. It's hard. I wrote about this in Soccer Brain. It's the toughest of hobbies or professions because you're dealing with different people's needs, wants, hopes, doubts, beliefs, let alone their different biologies, their different nervous systems and brain. And it is tough. So you do have to be kind on yourself. You can't be too hard on yourself, but there is almost this paradox whereby at the same time, you do have to be tough on yourself. You do have to, coming back to teaching or coaching as a performance profession, you do have to self-reflect in the car on the way back home and say, Johnny or Mary didn't. I was teaching this. I was telling them about this, but they weren't learning. I didn't see behavior change. What am I not doing, or what do I need to improve? Where do I need to go, or who do I need to use to be able to impact behavior, to see behavior change? So there seems to be, for me anyway, Doug, there's this paradox of, yes, you do have to be kind on yourself because it is a really tough professional hobby, but you've also got to be tough on yourself. And a part of that process is delivering psychological safety within your culture, within your environment. It's kind of somehow getting across to players that mistakes happen, even if it's just very overtly. Mistakes happen. This is part of the process. I am going to co-create solutions with you. I'm taking responsibility here to help you be a better learner. And before you come back at me, last thing to say here is that comes back to your relationship thing that you said a few minutes ago, which is I think coaches are very quick to see the psychosocial side as I've got to establish a relationship, and this relationship is a social relationship. It's high fives and everything's great, and it's not necessarily a task relationship, or they don't see it as a task relationship. And you know what? A lot of the conversations I have with coaches, but I also have with players. When players don't necessarily like a coach or a manager, or they've fallen out or whatever, I'm saying, don't forget here, you have a choice. You have a relationship choice. You don't have to love or like your coach or your manager. You can actually see this coach as a manager as Machiavellian as it sounds. You can see them as somebody who's just there to help you. And relationship, just the psychosocial relationship isn't just one of social, it's one of task as well.
I think that's so spot on. All of the affective high-fiving, and if a player doesn't feel trust and respect in you in the process, they don't feel like they're getting better, if they don't feel like they have candor from the coach, like I think this is the hardest part of relationship building, is truth-telling. Don't pretend that everything's fine. I'd rather have you tell me what I need to do, and then maybe tell me you believe that I'm capable of doing it, that this needs to happen, and that it's your job and my job, or some combination, to make sure that it gets done. But this is the thing that needs to happen for you to get minutes, as opposed to like, yeah, you're fine, and someone else just is better than you, right? Maybe that's the case, but in the end, people feel, I think, frustrated when they don't feel like when there isn't transparency and there isn't truth. It's one of the hardest things to deliver in a coaching environment.
So from that perspective, you might not have the social relationship from liking somebody's personality. But
you don't have to be best friends with everybody.
Yeah, but that task relationship, I mean, I'm using this word task, and obviously social task I'm getting from the idea of cohesion, but bringing it into coach-player relationships. Task relationships, if I can help you get better, that is encompassed or encircled by honesty. And it's honesty is an interesting one, because I've recently had a coach sort of allude to the fact that you can't be honest with players all the time. And I think what he was trying to say, and I do understand where he's coming from, is honesty can conflict with self-efficacy, that being self-belief and confidence. But what I hear you kind of saying there is it's having the language skills to be able to present an honest appraisal of somebody and wrap that in amongst having the relationship to say, but you're here, you're A, you're not at point B, I'm being honest with you here, but you know what? I'm going to take you on this journey, and I know that we're going to create together these skills that's going to get you there. Would I be right with that?
Absolutely. You used a phrase that I really like in there that I've just been reflecting on as you've been talking. You used the word language skills, and I think it's one of the most underrated things in coaching. And I think it's something that responds to practice and preparation. So it's a bit of a digression, but using exactly the right words to describe it in a complex situation is I would not leave that to chance, right? I think if I was going to have this conversation with a player who I have to be really honest with in a difficult way, like I would say that I should write out key phrases in advance and even practice them. We one of the workshops that we do here in the US is we work with deans of students. The deans of students are like the equivalent of, I think you would call it pastoral in a British school. It's these are people who work with kids who behave poorly in class, who are struggling with their behavior. They're sent to the dean of students, and the dean of students deals with it, right? Could be like, here's a conversation about what you need to do differently. Could be bring your parents down to the school. Could be that there's some sort of significant consequence. And so we practice with them having conversations that are about being critical of behavior while reaffirming faith in the individual, right? You know, I care about you and I want you to be successful, but I will never tolerate this behavior from you. Or even not only but maybe because I care about you and I want you to be successful, I will never tolerate anything less than your best effort, right? We spend a lot of time practicing that kind of language so that we're good at it. We have a good ear for it. It comes out right in the moment under duress when everyone's upset, right? When in the moment of tension, I want to plan for it when I can for a conversation, but sometimes the conversation is going to happen when I don't see it coming. I'm going to be walking by someone in a hallway in the bowels of the stadium, and they're going to say something to me that, you know, it's going to cause the moment of tension, and where like exactly the right candor is ready. And so I really believe that, like, what a great thing to practice on the car ride home from training is phrases for just differentiating like your behavior, your actions from the fundamental person that you are, right? I always want to affirm my faith in you. I believe you're capable of this. I believe you can do it if you put, I believe you're going to do it if you put your mind to it. But here's the thing that I cannot accept from you: insufficient work rate on the field. I believe that you can be a top player. I believe you want it. I believe you're going to do it. Yep. And it's my job to tell you when you're not your best, but that was not your best. And I will never disrespect you by telling you that it's okay to not give your best on the field, right? Like, I think just rehearsing language like that is so important. I'd never thought about it before, but those language skills, I think, are a hidden competency of coaching.
Yeah, kind of a silent mediator of success.
Yeah.
And I think, Doug, I'm thinking there as you're talking, I think about all the interactions or the situations that I've experienced over the last 15 years working in, whether it's elite sport or just sport within the grassroots, is that how many challenging situations could have been solved more effectively, perhaps not perfectly every time, but certainly more effectively had the coach delivered in that manner. So as you succinctly say, critical of behavior while reaffirming faith. And it seems to be, again, I think many people would almost see that as a contradiction, but it's having that flexibility of language. It's having that dynamic whereby you're able to do that. And just your little sort of 2-minute sort of talk there, just again, I'm thinking how many coaches practice their language skills? How many practice discourse? How many practice interactions in their own mind? Again, how we're so socialized in coaching into tactical, into the X's and the O's, and we're so good at, whether it's in football, reading Pep Guardiola and memorizing the way he likes to set up a team, or whether it's in American football, Bill Belichick, and how maybe he likes to set up his team within that sport. And we memorize those and we process them at a deep level. Yet the craft of coaching is language, and the craft of coaching is communication, and we don't necessarily rehearse those moments, those language skills.
I'd love to tell you two quick stories
Please do.
that are, I think, apropos. One of them is when I was working the schools we founded. I was managing one of the principals of our school, and she was doing her end of year meetings with her teachers. So this is the end of the year meeting where they talk about here's how things went, and some people get invited back. And some people, she said, some people, it's really hard conversation. It's like, thank you for your work this year. But I'm not going to offer you a contract for next year because X, Y, Z. And some of them is like, I can offer you a contract if the following things happen. And some of them are, you've done great. I'm so grateful for all your work. Here's your contract, right? You can imagine the player analogies. So she was anxious about these. So we practiced some of them. So we sat in her room and I pretended to be the teacher, and she went through the conversation with me. She went through the ones that she was anxious about. And every one of those conversations went really, really well because she really practiced a lot of the things that we're talking about, which is I have faith in you. I believe in you. Here are the things that need to happen. I recognize that this is a difficult choice and I support you either way. And I will, the ones that we didn't practice were the ones that she thought were going to be easy. The ones with her top performers, which is ironic because they're the most important people in the organization. Her top performers are much more important in the end than the people who were at the bottom tier. Many, like some people who left or some people who continued as part of the organization, but they're not really people who drive excellence. And one of them went really badly. She just wasn't ready for it. The teacher she just wanted to be appreciated for something that she had done. Mm-hmm. It was really important to verbalize it to her. She didn't. She ended up in tears. It took a lot of work to mop up after it, and in some ways, their relationship was never quite the same. So, I think it was a success story because by practicing for these conversations, the really difficult ones went really well. And ironically, the blind spot was it's also important to practice for the good conversations because they're actually more important in many ways. The other thing I was thinking about when you were talking is one of the reasons why coaches get upset when players make mistakes is because they're not psychologically ready for it themselves. When they sit down with a piece of paper and plan their training sessions, as you described, they're expecting everything to go perfectly. But you said earlier, look, like we know error is inevitable. So one of the most effective tools that, when I do training sessions with coaches, we often do something which is planning for error, which is you tell me the purpose of your activity, right? Then I want you to describe the exemplar. What does excellence look like? I think this is another bit of a blind spot. What are you doing with your players today? We're working on building out of the back. That's an activity that doesn't describe to me what excellence looks like building out of the back. So the first thing I should do is I should describe what I want it to see, what it to look like if it's outstanding. But then the next thing I should do is I should think, so if they struggle, if they get it wrong, what are the two things that are most likely to happen? What are the two things that are what are the two most likely mistakes that I will see? And what will I do about it? Then what will I do about it if I see them? And so I think this does a couple of things. One, it just psychologically prepares coaches for the inevitability of error, right? I didn't expect this. I thought there would be mistakes. The interesting thing is, are they the mistakes that I thought, or are they different mistakes? But then I'm not mad, right? Because I knew from the outset, I prepared myself for the fact that things were going to go wrong. And then I get in the habit of seeing the training through the player's eyes and thinking about what could be difficult and how I'll react to it. So that if the mistake that I anticipated happens, I'm prepared for it. I can say, great, pause, let's do this a little bit differently. Here's what I want to change about this. Good example of this, I did this with some pro coaches in the US. They were talking about how they were working on defending crosses in their own third. And and so we talked about, so what are the guys likely to get wrong? And the coach said, we're pretty good at defending the first cross. What happens is guys lose their man after the first cross, they lose sight of him. And when the second cross comes back quickly, they've lost their mark and more vulnerable. And so great. When this happened in practice, not only did he not get mad at the players, but then he knew what he was going to do. He positioned an assistant coach on the far side. And as soon as the first cross went across, the assistant coach hit a second cross back across so that they were able to practice not losing sight of their man over and over. So he had anticipated errors. This one worked out. He got it right, which is great. But even if you get it wrong, just the habit of thinking about what's likely to go wrong here helps you to understand the psychology and the mentality of players. And so over the long run, it just gets you smarter at the task of coaching if you're constantly thinking about what's going to be hard. What's going to be hard for players in doing this, as opposed to just presuming that because you explained it to them, they will be able to execute it fully and completely on the first iteration. So this task, which we call planning for error, I think is one of the most powerful tools that coaches can use, both technically to help make sure their training sessions are more effective at getting results, but also just for dealing with the emotions that come out when failure inevitably emerges in the course of training.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I'm doing recordings for podcasts, and I can think of, as you were speaking there, I was thinking of the conversation I had with Damien Hughes, who's just written a great book. He's a sports psychology consultant over here, or organizational psychology as well. He's just written The Barcelona Way. So he's just spent the last few years studying Barcelona and their culture. And we were talking about the what ifs, and how important that's been at Barcelona, just asking, well, what if it goes wrong? What if it goes wrong? What are we going to do? What are we going to put right? So it was reminding me of that. And also, actually, I recently interviewed Dr. Chris Shambrook, who is he's a fantastic sports psychologist. He's the lead psychologist for British rowing over here, which has over the last 2 decades has been one of the most successful Olympic teams going. And again, he was actually talking about simulating failure with teams. Actually, the way we described it, we used the scale of 1 to 10, and what does 10 out of 10 look like? When you're defending in the final third, and but what does 2 out of 10? What does 5 out of 10? And actually getting players talking about doing this and then dealing with that. So committing errors, and then what I've got to do to deal with that error. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like, I wonder why coaches, and you see competitors from all sports don't do this. And there's 2 things I can think of. I remember reading a book by a psychologist who's based at UCL in London, University College London, called Tali Sharot, and she wrote a book called The Optimism Bias. And I'm kind of riffing here and making up as I go along, but I just wonder if there's an element of our brains that I certainly know there can be a pessimism bias with our brains, but I wonder if there's an element of optimism bias whereby it's like we write out our activities as coaches, and we're like, hey, it'll be great, it's all going to go well. Or I wonder if it's a case of, we're so socialized into, we got to perform really well. It's got to be good. It's got to be good. It's got to be good. I shouldn't think of the negative. And somebody comes across and says, well, what if it goes wrong? And suddenly you get a barrage of coaches going, yeah, but I don't want to think that way. That's thinking negative. And we've got to get past that as coaches, and we've got to get past that as competitors. I mean, I think one of the most important questions I ask a footballer or a rugby player or a golfer or a tennis player or any sports competitor is, what are you going to do if it goes wrong? What are you going to do if you drop the first set? What are you going to do if you start double bogey? What are you going to do if we go a goal down, in the first 5 minutes? Will you make a few mistakes? What are you going to do? And sometimes the immediate response from a competitor is, oh, don't ask me that. That's horrible. But then rehearsing that, how you're going to deal with it, I just think is so important. And it's the same for coaches as teachers in that environment.
I think that's really fascinating. I was thinking about that phrase, the optimism bias. And when you said it, the first thing I thought of was that when you're coaching or teaching, I think there is an optimism bias. It's important to remember that you are not a neutral observer to your own training session. You have a vested psychological interest in convincing yourself that the news is better than it is, right? That you're successful, that your work is great. So you go home and you're like, that was a great training session, right? No one wants to go home and say, my work today was crap. Right? I mean, or just, I worked really hard. I did everything I was supposed to do. That just didn't work. And so I think observation is one of the most undervalued tools of a coach, right? As soon as your players start executing, your job becomes data analysis. Am I watching carefully enough for the right things to observe whether they're doing at a sufficient level the thing that I've asked them to do? That's very hard. It's a very complex visual environment. It's hard to focus on it. It's hard to tell. And so, and you're fighting against yourself psychologically because you want to believe that they're succeeding. when the news may be more mixed than that. So one of the things I also sometimes work on with coaches is just data gathering tools, which is when you're watching, am I just watching and kind of informally thinking, yeah, they're doing pretty well? Or am I like, do I plan in advance? These are the three things I want to see. I'm going to put a tick mark here every time I see this mistake. I'm going to keep track of who's doing it well and who's. Am I treating this like data, or am I just kind of passively watching? Because you are much more likely to recognize important trends and the important reality of performance if you treat it like data than if you just kind of watch informally and allow yourself to round up and be like, yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Let's move on to the next thing. When in fact, 3 players didn't master it. Maybe 8 players did. Some of the, it was only good 5 out of 8 times. Right? We always have to, I just think fighting against ourselves for objectivity of observation is one of the hidden critical tasks of coaching.
I think, again, as you're talking there, that observation piece, rather than, I'm kind of talking to the audience here of the podcast, maybe see your coaching when you step onto that pitch or court or course. Don't see it as passively watching, see it as data observing or data collecting. I love that idea because it means your brain, your nervous system is processing deeply. It's observing. It's kind of reflecting back on. It's probably going all over the place, but it's reflecting back on performances from the past from players and reaching back into observations from previous sessions, and your brain and your nervous system in that moment is working really, really hard rather than just I'm passively watching. It's a little bit like the difference between, okay, I'm going to go to football here. Footballers, soccer players can tend to watch the game rather than think the game. If that makes sense, what you often get, and I used to see this. I mean, I've worked in about half a dozen Premier League academies over the last 15 years, and obviously sort of done bits and pieces in many more. And when I've observed training, what you find is a lot of the players who don't necessarily, there seems to be a bit of a correlation between players who don't make the next level and their ability to think the game. When they're on the pitch, they're in play and they're thinking the game. What next? As compared to just, I'm a centre back. I've headed it out. I'm done now, and now I just kind of watch the game. Mm-hmm. The guys the guys and the girls who think the game, who are in that what next mode, are making the next step up, the next grade, and it's this. It almost feels the same with coaching, in as much as you're out there, and to use your term, you're data collecting. Now I can come back to this idea of co-coaching as well, whereby I have the fortune of working alongside one of the world's leading skill acquisition coaches, a guy called Dr. Rick Shuttleworth, who's a brilliant skill ac coach, and something he said to me is there's nothing better than getting that, if we're going to use the term data, real-time data. Get the data from your players. Mm-hmm. Have a co-coach go in when one activity is done and they're maybe having a water break, having a drink of water, whether it's you or even better still a co-coach, because they might be more honest, get in there and say, how did that go? Was that not just how did that go from a perspective of how well did you do, but what did you think of that coaching session? What did you think of that activity? Yeah.
And maybe even decide in advance with those co-coaches what we want to be looking for, so that so we've decided what are the most important things we'll see, whether you're watching me as a coach or the players executing. Yeah. Then at the water break, I can say, what did you see? And I know they're going to talk about like whatever the most important things are, as opposed to like, Mullins didn't seem very engaged. Okay, fine.
Yeah,
that's not what I care about. So I think you can even preparing for that is a brilliant idea. We call this idea in the 2.0 version of Teach Like a Champion, which if anyone reads it, I definitely recommend the 2.0 version over the 1.0 version. We call it tracking, not watching in the classroom, which is like, so I'm thinking, I'm not watching, I'm tracking data. I'm intentionally tabulating things. If you're watching, maybe this is more so in the classroom, but if I'm watching a complex visual environment where 18 players are trying to execute on fairly sophisticated technical things, probably more than one thing at once. If I think I'm going to be able to watch that passively and just keep track in my head of what happened, as opposed to like having a tool for tracking the events in a data way, I'm kidding myself. So, having a clipboard or a piece of paper where you're jotting down notes or tabulating what you're seeing, I think turning it into data is really, really important. So we call that tracking, and I think it's important. And one other thing I loved your point about players' level of mental engagement and that being a driver of long-term success. And I just had two quick thoughts about that. One, watching this training session that I watched the other day, it was the day before a match, so it was a little bit of a light. It was a light training load, so they were playing 6v6, and two teams were off and two teams were on. So the players were, like half of the players were not playing, and the question we talked about was, so what were they doing? Like they were cheering for each other, but giving them specific things to watch for. Right, you're a center back. You should be watching the other center back and always be alert to whether he is maintaining adequate pressure, whether his positioning is good, what his first touch is like, what decisions, like giving players specific tasks so that when they're watching, there's watching the game and there's watching the game. There's watching the game as like a plot. Did we win? And then there's watching it technically for like what decisions and what's the quality of execution. I think what I want to do is build a habit of mental alertness whenever players are on the field where they're studying the game. And I think that's actually something that I can build into the culture of my practices. One, when players are off, but even then, like when they're on the field, you mentioned at the beginning of our session, cold calling. Lots of times when we stop and we ask questions, we ask like rhetorical questions, where should the number 6 be here? And so either no one will answer or the two most verbal people on the team will say, he should be deeper, or they'll guess, right? But what I want to build is a culture where everyone feels accountable for being mentally locked in at any time. Because if there are 3 players who are answering that verbally, it means that 15 players are not answering and they're not really engaging the question. And so they're not mentally locked in and thinking about where the number 6 should be at the point. So I think it's really powerful to pause and say, pause, Dan, where should the number 6 be? Great. And if the number 6 is deep, where does the number 8 have to go? Charles? Great. And Keon, what does that mean for the outside backs? Right. So there I'm building the expectation that when you walk into the field, you're mentally locked in at all times. And I think if you do that for long enough, you can build a mental culture. It's as important as physical culture. Physical culture meaning like hustle. Do we work hard? Yes, that's really important to build competitiveness and hard work. But mentally locked in, I'm always thinking about what the game should look like. What my role is another piece of culture that is important and challenging to build. And I think that there are a variety of tools that coaches can use to do that. One of them, I think, is that just this notion of cold calling, which is I'm going to keep it fast. I'm going to keep you on your toes, and I'm not going to just sort of leave it to 3 people to answer the questions for the team. Everyone has to be ready to answer every question because the game asks questions of you, and you can't duck them. And you can't duck them in the game, so you shouldn't be able to duck them in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to come back to cold calling in a second, but I like what you said earlier about manipulate is my word here, but manipulating the task to be able to turn up the volume of mental engagement in essence. So I think that's such an important thing because that's something that I think coaches have to recognize is they don't have to use their voice to engage players. They can change and this is where a lot of people on Twitter, coaches on Twitter who come from, it's basically ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory. And that's without going into too much detail. And to be fair, it's still an area I'm learning, but it's very much, if I change the task, that alone can change behavior. And so it can engage players. And so I think it's useful for coaches to build the ability to change that task. It might be making the task tougher. It might be asking a player to look at something, giving them a task which is to look at something specific and monitor something, as you say, not watching the game, but actively watching the game, thinking the game. And that alone can keep them engaged, which in turn changes behavior or develops skill, in our case in sport. So I think that's really important to say. You nodded your head there with the ecological psychology because I think it's an interesting world here, because I think what some to sort of lightly challenge the conversation we're both having here is that what some people would say is learning, and I'm going to be very brash and broad brush here, learning mathematics in a classroom is different to learning football on a pitch. In as much as learning mathematics is far more in tune with, I as a teacher have this information in this head about mathematical theorems and formulas, and I'm going to give you this, and then I'm going to test your understanding, and my job is to keep you engaged. And I've watched the videos that you have on YouTube, and they're brilliant, and it's about keeping young people engaged and helping them learn these theorems and then testing their performance, etc., etc. Whereas on the football pitch, where there's the dynamic is slightly different in terms of, it's not so much I have this, it can be I have this knowledge, I want to deliver this knowledge to you. But what maybe ecological psychologists working within sport or dynamic system theorists would say is, actually, you have to set up an environment, or it's useful to set up an environment and tasks that help players understand themselves. You provide them with a problem, and what you promote is their own unique way of solving that problem. I don't know, there isn't an optimal biomechanical way of doing this. There isn't necessarily an optimal tactical way of doing this. It's just I set the task and I want them to accomplish the task, and then I'll ask questions about how they do that to ingrain their knowledge of themselves, if you like. So I don't know if you've had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. For the most part, I was nodding when you were saying ecological dynamics, because for the most part, I guess what I was nodding at first was I do think that coaching football is different from, well, I don't want to simplify teaching math. In many ways, there's a lot of decision making and problem solving there, especially in higher math.
Yeah.
But it's a decision making game. It's a problem solving game. It's incredibly complex, and in fact, it's more complex because it's coordinated decision making among 11 different players at the same time. So the thing I love about ecological dynamics is the notion that as often as possible, I want to place. I think the role of perception in decision making is vastly underrated. Half of the machinery in our brains is just perceptive machinery, and the interesting thing is we're not aware of how it works. So to go back to the story of batters in Major League Baseball, and for years, people thought that great hitters in baseball were better because they had better reaction time.
Yep.
Until someone tested Albert Pujols, who at the time was the best hitter in the major league and had been for years, and they found that his reaction time was below average for the adult male population. Not below average for baseball players, below average for the adult male population in the United States. So it can't be reaction time. And what it turns out that it is, it's perception. When the pitcher is getting ready to pitch, Pujols is watching things that he is entirely unaware of. The rate of rotation of the pitcher's hips, his shoulder, the angle of his elbow compared to his shoulder. Is it going to be a curveball or is it going to be a fastball?
Yep.
So perception is the decision, especially when it's fast in many cases. But he is totally unaware of this. Like, he doesn't even know that he's doing this. He probably thinks it's reaction time, and probably left to his own devices would practice his reaction time to make himself a better hitter, right? So perception, I think, much of the decision is perception. When players don't make the right pass, is it that they saw the opening and decided not to pass, or that they never saw the opening at all or didn't see it fast enough? So one of the things I love about the notion of ecological dynamics is, as often as I can, I want to place training in situations that recreate the visual field of the game. So, because reading it is really what a lot of decision making is. And then I think I can emphasize that by making my stoppages. Instead of saying, what should you do here? I think a great question is, what do you see here? What should you do? Right? Like that's a big part of, I suspect if you were able to find out what made the players who are the best decision makers work, the difference would be where their eyes go. What are they looking at to make their decision? So I love that. I love that notion that what I think is a deep emphasis on perception. The only thing I disagree with is that I think you're still talking about, this is still a knowledge-driven endeavor. That, I think one of the real findings of cognitive science about the classroom in the last 5 or 10 years is that, I think a lot of people want to perceive higher order thinking, problem solving as different from knowledge. And in fact, in many ways in conflict with knowledge. Why would we teach facts when we should be teaching decision making? But in fact, I think you need knowledge to be able to do higher order thinking and decision making. When was the last time you or I had a deep thought about particle physics or chemistry, right? We don't, because we don't, well, I can't speak for you, but I don't know enough about it. And so I think constraints-based coaching, where I create different challenges for players to have them reflect on what they're learning, is really important, especially when I precede it with really, really deliberate background knowledge, right? Here's what, especially vocabulary, to be able to talk about the games. When we're pressing, what are the important things to be doing when we're pressing? When we're pressing in a 3-5-2 versus a 4-4-2, I think people underestimate the role of knowledge in decision making. So I kind of agree with, I like a lot of the sort of ecological coaching. I just think it, like, sometimes people interpret it as being like, especially if I'm trying to coordinate a reliable, predictable way the decision making of 11 different players at once. They have to have a shared vocabulary. They have to have a shared knowledge.
Yeah.
So to me, that I would just want to combine that with a knowledge-rich environment where we talk about what we're trying to do, what we want to accomplish in a really clear way, and then let people go figure out how to accomplish it and how to make decisions in an ecological environment.
I think my I think my interpretation of the knowledge situation is, and I sort of fall back to my golf coaching and how I would have coached back sort of to over 15 years ago, was the traditional, watch somebody swing. They come along for a lesson, watch somebody swing, hit shots, and I've got this knowledge of how somebody should swing, maybe this biomechanical ideal scenario, and then provide them with this knowledge so that now they have this knowledge, and be with them while they practice this new movement within the swing, and fingers crossed they start to hit great shots again, which often didn't happen. But if I could go back in a time machine, and maybe one day I will start golf coaching again. Who knows what the future holds? But what I would do is have, where I think the knowledge in golf, and I'll bring this into other sports in a minute, where I think the knowledge in golf has to happen is more around the absolutes of the club head and the golf ball. That's where the laws lie, the law of the impact. And I would rather help, if I'm coaching you golf, and I don't know if you play, Doug, but I want to start helping you understand more about how to, I want you to understand that by applying the club on the ball in a specific way, it will produce this kind of shot. And then once we've had that conversation, let's experiment now. Let's see if we can get the ball going right to left and left to right based on the laws of the ball flight relative to the club head. So that, rather than, if you take the club back on plane, if you hinge your wrists to the top of the swing, if you transfer your weight, blah, blah, blah. So almost the sort of biomechanics of the swing. I'd want you to explore movement around the laws of the golf club and the ball. And I suppose the best relationship I can have, if I brought it back to, say, let's say football, there's obviously other sports, but let's say football, it's like you've alluded to, it's having it's setting up the task, setting up the environment, making that a representational learning design. So it's got to look like, what football looks like, the game. But then it's setting up a problem, and if I'm going to have if I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to have conversations with that player. It revolves around that problem. I'm not going to tell a player what to do. It's helping them it's having a conversation with a player, asking the right questions, getting them thinking about what they're doing, what they're seeing, as you said, why they made that decision based on what they've seen. So it's a kind of a knowledge of self. It's a kind of knowledge of what I want to understand as a football player. Why am I making that decision? What am I seeing? And as a coach, if I can start having those kind of conversations, I think that's useful knowledge. And it's coupled with a representational learning design. Hey, I'm still learning this stuff, so this is a great conversation for me to have. Did that kind of make sense?
It does, absolutely. I mean, I think what you're describing, I would describe what you're describing as knowledge-based exploration, which is I can explore more effectively when I understand the principles of the club face and grip and all the things that you've explained. And the same on the football field, if I understand the principles of we want to invite pressure to draw players into the ball, and then I'm going to play out of it with a short pass. It's where my intention is often to hit a long pass, right? If I can invite pressure around the ball, then I want to get the ball as quickly as I can, far away from that point to a far open man, right? If I understand those principles of play, then, and my whole team does, then they can explore together how to accomplish that in different settings. I think there are two different types of problem solving. One is what's the right solution here? And one is how do I implement or execute the solution in a complex environment? And I think generally speaking, people spend more time on the first, but the second is actually oftentimes the more relevant question, which is how do we go about accomplishing the thing that we're trying to accomplish in this situation? So I guess that would be my analogy for knowledge-based exploration in a group invasion game. It could be totally wrong.
No, that's absolutely spot on, and it's something I'm exploring as well. And Doug, I know that you're pushed for time, and I'm so appreciative of the time you spent with me. Thank you so much. Just last thing to ask you before you go is, where can people find you?
Thanks for asking. I am on Twitter at Doug_Lemov, Lemov, and I have a website. It's called teachlikeachampion.com. And I've really enjoyed chatting with you and hope to talk again soon.
Doug, thank you very much. Take care.
Cheers.
Doug, thanks so much. That was Doug Lemov, everyone. I hope you got lots from that. I certainly did. If you did, please leave a review. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast as well. I'm already looking forward to next week's guest. I hope you can join me. Bye for now.